All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Daniel and Batsheva Pava of Hashmonaim, Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shema Droshos this month, the commemoration of their father, Reb Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vegh of Philadelphia, on the occasion of his first Yahrzeit. Reb Shlomo was a child survivor of Aushwitz, the talmid muvhak of Reb Michel Ber Weismendel. He had left 90 plus descendants who, Baruch Hashem, are yireh Shamaim. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, his neshama will have an aliya and the family a neshama. Our week of learning sponsors, Yehuda Jennie Goodhart, the commemoration of the Yahrzeit of Jennie's father, Yeshaya Zalman ben Lazar, and the Brem family, Le'ilui Nishmas, their mother, Leah Riva Chaya Bas Meir, Mrs. Louise Brem, on the occasion of her 25th Yahrzeit. Steve Goloskov, in memory of Toba Rabinowitz, Toba Bas Yoshua, Yaacov Zichron Livracha, sister of Shevy Friedman, and in memory of Adina Adina Batsheva Bas Dov Ber Azriel, Zichron Livracha, sister of Yossi Openden. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshama slav and aliya, the families a neshama, all of our hostages will be returned home to their mishpachos, b'shalom and b'karov. Our precious soldiers will be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yadehem, and we should share besoros tovos for all of Am Yisrael. But so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Some really incredible Gemara ahead of us over the next couple of days. Today's daf is Vav 15. We are picking up on Yud Daled Amud Beis 14b at the 2 dots, 3 lines before it gets wide. 3 lines before it gets wide. Okay? Good. Says the Gemara, Tarabanan. Sidron Shalvim. Here is the order of the prophets. Now, let's remember again, just to follow the progressions. Remember, we spent a lot of time speaking yesterday. Well, yesterday we spent a lot of time speaking about scrolls. Again, the evolution of our conversation was, we went to 3 machlokes about how you're allowed to construct scrolls. Can you put Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim all in one scroll? Not in one scroll. Torah one scroll, Nevi'im one scroll, because you have to do different scrolls for different Nevi'im. We then went on to discuss this concept of having a scroll that has the same height and circumference. That then led into a conversation about the dimensions of the Aron, right? Again, and all that whole, what was in the Aron, what wasn't in the Aron. So now the Gemara is circling back to Nevi'im. So the order of the Nevi'im: Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yirmiyah, Yecheskel, Yeshaya, Ushneim Asar. Shneim Asar also refers to Trei Asar, which we call the 12 minor prophets. Now, again, I've always thought that name is a little bit misleading. There's no such thing as like a minor prophet. Kind of if you've made the grade of being a Navi, you're pretty much up there. What it means is they're the smaller Naviim, so they're grouped together in one book that we call Trei Asar. So the Gemara says, interesting, because Michti, Hosea Kadim, Hosea, who's included in Trei Asar, he came earlier, T'chsiv, Tchilas Devar Hashem B'Hosea. So again, literally the pasuk says that the beginning of the word of God was with Hosea, which sounds like Hashem spoke to Hosea earlier than the other prophets. V'chim Hosea diber Tchilas. So what do you think? That Hosea was the first of the Nevi'im? V'alo mi Moshe v'ad Hosea kama Nevi'im hayu. But between Moshe and Hosea, there were many different prophets. Rabbi Yochanan shaya Tchila la'arba'a Nevi'im shenisnavu ba'osa ha'perek. So Hosea lived in a time he had 4 other contemporary prophets. He was the first amongst his contemporaries. Ve'elohim. Who were his contemporaries? Hosea, Yeshaya, Amos, and Micha. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, so why don't you put the book of Hosea in front of those other 4? In other words, from that grouping of 4 that he's a part of, put him first in that grouping. To which the Gemara says, Kevan dechsev nevu'aseh gabe chagai zechayim malachi. This, since ultimately Hosea is mentioned, his prophecy is next to Chagai Zechayim Malachi. The Chagai Zechayim Malachi Sof Nevi'im Havu, and Chagai Zechayim Malachi were the last of the prophets. Therefore, Chashav Le Bahadayu, Hosea is placed alongside of them. So why not go ahead and write Hosea? In other words, why does Hosea have to be included in Trei Asar at all? Why don't you write him as his own book, his own sefer, and put him earlier? To which the Gemara says, "Aidi dezuta mirchas." There was a concern about say Sefer Hosea is a short navi. There was a concern that because the sefer itself is short, if it was reckoned as a separate independent sefer, perhaps it would get lost. Absolutely get lost. Okay, so Michti Yeshaya Kadimir V'Yecheskel. So Yeshaya, the prophet Yeshaya, came before Yirmiyah and Yecheskel. Liktame Yeshaya Bereisha. Why not? So you can see over here in the order of Nevi'im. So Yeshaya comes after Yirmiyah and Yecheskel. But in fact, Yeshaya chronologically came before. So why not put his sefer earlier? To which the Gemara says, "Kevan de malachim sofei chorbana, v'Yirmiyah kulei chorbana, v'Yecheskel reishei chorbana, v'sefer nechemta." So I said because there's an order. There's almost like a thematic order. The end of the book of Malachim talks about the destruction of Beis Hamikdash. So since the end of Malachim ultimately again is Chorban, 10 tribes Chorban, and Yirmiyah, the Navi Yirmiyah talks all about Chorban, and Yecheskel, Reisha Chorbana v'Seifa Nechemta. Yecheskel, the beginning is Chorban, the end is consolation. V'Yeshaya Kula Nechemta, and Yeshaya is all consolation. So it makes sense ultimately again Samchina Chorbana l'Chorbana u'Nechemta l'Nechemta. We juxtapose Nevi'im that speak about Chorban with Chorban, and those which speak about Nechama with Nechama. So since Yeshaya is all Nechama, ultimately again he follows Yecheskel, who ends off with Nechama. Beautiful. Sidron Shel Ksuvim. So we'll say, what's the order of Ksuvim? So the Gemara says, Rus, Sefer Tehillim, Iyov, Mishlei, Koheles, Shira Shirim, Vikinos, Daniel, Umegillas Esther, Ezra, V'Divrei Hayamim. Okay, so that's the list. That's the list of Ksuvim. Ayol the Amar Iyov b'mei Moshe Haya liktame le'Iyov Bereisha. I will say we're going to spend a lot of time on this tomorrow. Tomorrow's daf is virtually all about Iyov, Job, all about Iyov. We're going to see one of the major machlokim that exists is when did Iyov live? When did Iyov live? Even an opinion that says Iyov didn't live. The entire book of Iyov is a metaphor. There was no such thing as a person named Iyov. We'll discuss all of that tomorrow. But the Gemara kind of dangles that in front of us right now. The Gemara says, "Lamando Amar Iyov b'mei Moshe Haya liktame le'Iyov Bereisha." So I'll say, so here's what's interesting. So obviously, Iyov comes over here after Sefer Tehillim, between Tehillim and Mishlei. But according to the opinion that says that Iyov lived during times of Moshe Rabbeinu, why not put Iyov in the beginning? It should be, right? Iyov should be the first. So the Gemara says, "Aschuli b'parusa lo maschalinan." We'll say the book of Iyov, and we'll discuss this in very depth tomorrow. But the book of Iyov is a really difficult book, a really difficult story, all about suffering. All about suffering. So the Gemara says we don't exactly want to begin the list of Ksuvim with suffering. Rus nami paranasi. But the book of Rus is also about suffering. Right after again, I will say, remember again, the book of Rus begins with famine, deaths of Machlon and Kilyon, death of Elimelech. Then at the end of the Sefer, right, you have the death of Boaz. So Rus also has a lot of suffering. To which the Gemara says, no, Paranos de Isle Achris. We'll say this is incredible. Rus has suffering, but Rus is a book of suffering that has hope in the end. So I will say a very profound statement. That ultimately, again, a book of suffering that has hope in the end is not called a book of suffering. Which I will say is such a profound statement because is that not the metaphor and the story of our people? Right? Klal Yisrael as a people, we have suffered so much. So what keeps us going? So we know that even though there's paranos, the yesh la achris, there is a future. There is a future. That's what allows us to get through every difficult situation. No matter how intense the suffering may be, the yesh la achris, I always know this is not the end of our story. This is not the end of our narrative. This is not the end of the journey. And the knowledge that there's a future, the knowledge that there's an achris, the knowledge that Emeres Hashem, there's still more beauty and more bracha to come, that's what keeps us moving forward. Incredible. Why was Rus called Rus? What was the meaning of the name Rus? The Gemara says, Shiyatsa mimena David, because ultimately again David HaMelech emerged from her. Sherivu la'Kadosh Baruch Hu b'shiros shpachos. And I will say, David HaMelech kiviyach, like saturated HaKadosh Baruch Hu with praises. So the name Rus is actually interesting, right? Because what is the etymological root of Rus? So the Gemara understands that it's Rava, to saturate. That Rus literally had a descendant who saturated the Ribono Shel Olam with praise. So beautiful. So beautiful. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, good. Umi Kasvan. So the Gemara says, Umi Kasvan. Who wrote all of these Svarim? So Moshe says, now we're going to go through the authorship of all of these Svarim. So Moshe Kasef Sifro, Uparshas Bilam V'Iyov. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah. wrote the Torah. He wrote, that's what it calls, isn't that incredible? The Gemara calls the Torah Sifro, Moshe Rabbeinu Sefer. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that to be on the level where the Torah is called your Sefer? So Moshe Rabbeinu wrote his Sefer, Parshas Bilam. Now this is interesting, right? Because we'll say Parshas Bilam is the whole story of Bilam and Balak, what we call Parshas Balak, Parshas Bilam. They will say now, interestingly enough, obviously if Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the whole Torah, he also wrote Parshas Bilam. So Rashi points out over here, Rashi says Parshas Bilam, Nivu'asu u'mashalav, it's the prophecy and the mashalim, the parables of Bilam. Da'af bi she'inan tzarchei Moshe v'saraso v'seder masav. So we'll say, technically speaking, Parshas Bilam has nothing to do with Am Yisrael, so to speak. In other words, Bilam's prophecies and his mashalim, it's Torah, of course, but Lamaisa, again, it's not halachas for us. It's not, so it's reckoned a little bit separately than everything else. But yet Moshe Rabbeinu is the author for that as well. Okay? V'Iyov, and Moshe Rabbeinu also wrote the book of Iyov. Pretty interesting. We'll get more on that. Yehoshua Kasev Sifro, Yehoshua wrote Sefer Yehoshua, Ushmona Psukim Sheva Torah. Yehoshua also wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah. As much as we just said before that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, again, according to this opinion, and again, we're going to get into this as well, Moshe Rabbeinu did not write the last 8 psukim of the Torah. He will say, what's the topic of the last 8 psukim of the Torah? The death of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu did not write his own death, rather Yehoshua wrote that. Again, more on that in just a little bit. Shmuel Kasav Sifro. So Shmuel went ahead and wrote his own sefer, meaning Sefer Shmuel. V'Shoftim v'Rus. He also wrote the book of Shoftim and the book of Rus. David Kasav Sefer Tehillim Asar Zakenim. David HaMelech wrote Tehillim. That was is incredibly important. Sefer Tehillim is not only a compilation of David HaMelech's wisdom, but rather, again, David HaMelech ultimately included wisdom of 10 other wise men along with him. Who are these 10 other people? Ayidei Adam Arishon, Ayidei Malki Tzedek, Ayidei Avram, Ayidei Moshe, Ayidei Haman, Ayidei Yedusun, Ayidei Asaf. So we'll say, Va'ayidei top of Tesva, Va'ayidei Shlosha B'nei Korach, and also including the 3 sons of Korach. So we'll say, so it's interesting. So Rashi points out where you see these wise men mentioned throughout Sefer Tehillim. Now, some of them are more obvious. For example, Tefillah LeMoshe, Rashi points out, right? Tefillah LeMoshe, or Maskil LeHaman, or Lamnatseach LeYedusun. So Haman and Yedusun, we're going to discuss who exactly they are, but Bepashtus, they were members of Shevy Lady, of the Levitic choir. So we'll discuss in greater depth exactly who they are, and the 3 sons of Korach. Good, incredible. It was at top of Tesvav, 15a. Yirmiyah Kasav Sifro, the Sefer Malachim Mikinos. Yirmiyah, Prophet Jeremiah, wrote his own Sefer Yirmiyah, the book of Malachim, and Kinos. I will say now, again, just to point out, Kinos that we recite on Tisha B'Av, so Kinos isn't that right? Sefer Kinos could also be a reference to Sefer Eicha. To Megillas Eicha. So not necessarily Kinos as we recite it, because Kinos as we have it, we have the Masorah that they were compiled by Rabbi Lazar HaKalir, and the truth is there are other Kinos that were written over different periods of time. But Kinos over here means Megillas Eicha, the book which is the Megillah that details the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Chizkiah v'Siyaito, King Chizkiah and his chevra, Kasvu Yeshaya, Mishlei, Shirashirim, V'Koheles. Okay, so we'll say, so this is very interesting. So Chizkiah, remember again, Chizkiah Melech Yehuda was a great grandson of David HaMelech. He compiled Yeshaya, the Navi Yeshaya, Mishlei, Shirashirim, and Koheles. I will say, and here's what's interesting. Mishlei, Shirashirim, and Koheles, we often associate with who? Shlomo HaMelech. So what's going on over here? So take a look at Rashi. It's actually very interesting. Rashi says, Kasav Yeshaya. So first of all, here's the interesting departure, because up until now, what we've seen is the theme is every Navi writes his own Sefer. So what's going on? So why didn't Yeshaya write Sefer Yeshaya? Why is Chizkiah writing Sefer Yeshaya? So Rashi says over here, Kasav Yeshaya, Shahargo Menashe, Velo Kasav Sifro, Shalo Hayin Navim Kosem Sifrayan El Lifnei Mosan. In general, prophets would write down their svarim shortly before their deaths. Yeshayahu was killed by King Menashe. So therefore, again, never had the opportunity to write down his sefer. Therefore, Chizkiah writes Sefer Yeshayahu. See, interesting enough, similarly, Rashi points out, Mishlei Koheles, T'chsiv b'Sefer Mishlei, Asher Tiku Anshe Chizkiah, V'asher Chizkiah Garam Lo Lasok B'Torah Kidamina Mechilek Na'atzher. So it says to this. So why is it? So obviously, Mishlei, Shira Shirim, and Koheles are Shlomo HaMelech's wisdom. Why didn't Shlomo write them down? So it's interesting about say. So the Maharsha comments on this. The Maharsha says, remember the Gemara Maseches Gittin by Ashmedai that Shlomo HaMelech was thrown off his throne, dispossessed from his throne towards the end of his life. There's a whole machlokes in the Gemara. Melech Hedyot, Melech Hedyot. Did Shlomo HaMelech ever regain his monarchical standing after this whole episode with Ashmedai? So there's a machlokes, but even according to the opinion that says that he became king again, there was this tremendous setback for Shlomo HaMelech. As a result, the Gemara suggests Shlomo never actually codified or wrote down his own wisdom. So the wisdom was there, but it was Chizkiah who went ahead and actually wrote it down. Incredible. Anshe Knesset Agdolah, men of the Great Assembly, Kosvu Yechezkel, Shneim Asar, Daniel, Umegillas Esther. Incredible. Ezra Kasav Sifro. Ezra, right, wrote Sefer Ezra. V'yachas shal Divrei Hayamim. And Adlo, and wrote all the genealogies of Divrei Yamim, right, up until his own genealogy. This supports Rav, because Rav said the name of Rav. Lo Allah Ezra mi Bavel, achi yachas atzmo vi Allah. Ezra did not leave Bavel until he went ahead and codified his own genealogy, and then he was able to ascend. So the Gemara says, Uman Aske, who went ahead and finished up the rest of Sefer Ezra? Nehemiah ben Chachalya, the Navi Nehemiah. Okay, Amar Mar, Yehoshua Kasef Sifro, Shmona Psukim Shavah Torah. So we'll say, so now let's go back a little bit. So now we'll say, it's really one of these very interesting Gemaras, because now you have the entire authorship of Tanakh. Here's now you know everyone who wrote every single one of the Svarim. Now the Gemara is particularly intrigued by the last 8 psukim in the Torah, right? Because on one hand we said that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, but yet it credits Yehoshua with writing the last 8 psukim. So Amar, Yehoshua Kasev Sifro, Shmona Psukim Shavah Torah. So we said before that Yehoshua wrote Sefer Yehoshua, and also wrote the last 8 psukim in the Torah. So the Gemara says, Tanya Kimanda Amar, Shmona Psukim Shavah Torah, Yehoshua Kasvan. So we'll say, so there's a brisa that supports this idea, that the last 8 psukim in the Torah were written by Yehoshua. The Sanya, Vayamas Sham Moshe Eved Hashem. Remember, you're about to say, how does the Torah end? The Torah ends, well, it's not the last pasuk in the Torah, but the Torah says that Moshe Rabbeinu, the servant of Hashem, died there. So the Torah itself writes about the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. Efshar, Moshe Meis, V'kasa Vayamas Sham Moshe. How could it be that Moshe died? And Moshe's writing that Moshe died? Obviously, I will say, so the Gemara assumes over here, it can't be that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote about his own death. Ela'ad kan kasav Moshe, mikan ve'ilach kasav Yehoshua divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So rather, what do you have to say? That Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the entire Torah up until the section detailing his death. But the last 8 psukim which detail the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, ultimately those were written by Yehoshua. That's the first. That's Rabbi Yehuda. What's the great for this? V'armi Rabbi Nechemiah. Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says Chas Shalom. Efshar Sefer Torah Os. Efshar Sefer Torah Chaser Os Achos. Rabbi say, is it possible to say that the Sefer Torah is missing one letter? In other words, Rabbi say, what does that mean? The Gemara says, Uksev Lakoach Es Sefer HaTorah Hazeh. Rabbi say, now remember again, Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of his life writes a Sefer Torah and hands it to Shevet Levi. Rabbi say, remember again, this links back to yesterday's daf. The Sefer Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, right, was put inside of the Aron. So could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu, so the Torah says that Moshe Rabbeinu handed a Sefer Torah to Shevet Levi. So could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu handed them a deficient Sefer Torah? A Sefer Torah that was lacking 8 psukim that doesn't make any sense. Ella, the verse is incredible. Ella, Ad Kana Kadosh Baruch Hu Omer, Umoshe Omer V'Kosef. So we'll say, now watch this. Up until the last 8 psukim, which detail the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. So up until those last 8 psukim, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu would dictate, and Moshe Rabbeinu would write down. Now, I will say it's actually interesting. In the aleph over here, it takes out the word Omer. See, the way the Gemara reads is Ad Kana HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer. up until the last 8 psukim, so Kadosh Baruch Hu would dictate, Kadosh Baruch Hu would say it, Moshe Omer v'kosev, and Moshe would repeat it and write it down. So in the Hagos Habach, they take out the Omer. Moshe didn't repeat it; he would just write down. It is interesting that there is this girsa, that there is this version that Hashem would say it, then Moshe would repeat it, and then write it down. So I'll say, so what's interesting about that? Because again, almost like modeling for us a potential retention tool. This is why the Gemara discusses the idea that when you learn, you're supposed to learn out loud. Right? You're not supposed to just scan Gemara with your eyes. That's why, again, part of the beauty of learning is, developing your own little niggin, right? Developing your own little sing-song, when you learn. Part of the process of learning, ultimately, again, is saying the words. Both from a retention perspective, but also from a beautiful, neshama perspective as well. Rabbi Nachman writes, when Yaakov Avinu, one of my favorite idea, when Yaakov Avinu goes ahead and sends, this is before Yosef revealed his identity to the brothers. So people just think that he's some despotic, unpredictable ruler. So when they have to go back down to go ahead and retrieve Binyamin, so what does Yaakov Avinu say to them? Kichu mizimras haaretz. So literally go ahead and take from the vines of the land. Rabbi Nachman says, no. Kichu mizimras haaretz means zmiros haaretz. Take from the music, take from the niggin of the land. Eretz Yisrael has its own nigunim. Eretz Yisrael has its own music. There's a power in a nigun. There's a power in zimra to unlock something. So we all know this, right? Sometimes also our most emotional, overwhelming moments are not necessarily in front of the Gemara, but often, again, our most emotional and emotionally provocative moments are with music, or with a kumzis, or with a fabrengen, is with something that includes zimra. Kichum is zimra sa'aretz. So it's interesting over here that it could very well be that Moshe Rabbeinu modeled this for us. So what happens? The Kadosh Baruch Hu says the Torah, and Moshe Rabbeinu repeats it, probably in his own little niggin, right, in his own little sing-song, and then he goes ahead and writes it down. Something really beautiful, and a beautiful image. Can you imagine Moshe Rabbeinu? Can you imagine? I'll say Moshe Rabbeinu sitting, listening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Leimar," and Moshe says, "Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Leimar," and then he writes it down. How beautiful and incredible that must have been to see that. In any event, so the Gemara says as follows: "V'kosev mikan ve'ilach." But for the last 8 psukim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, Moshe kosev bedema. So Rabbi say, now watch this. For the Torah, Kadosh Baruch Hu says it, and Moshe Rabbeinu either writes it down or repeats it and writes it down. For the last 8 psukim, Moshe, same process. Hashem said it, and Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it, but he wrote it with tears. Rabbi say, now, lav dafka, he wrote it with his tears, but rather he wrote it crying. So Moshe Rabbeinu wrote his own death, and he wrote his death while crying. Now understand, it wasn't because Moshe Rabbeinu had a fear of death. If anyone understood what was waiting on the other side of this world, it was Moshe Rabbeinu. So why the tears? Because Rabbi say, when Moshe Rabbeinu wrote those psukim, it cemented the reality that he was not entering into Eretz Yisrael. And if there's one thing that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted more than anything, it is the ability to be in Eretz Yisrael. When my children were younger and we used to take them to Eretz Yisrael, I'd always say, when you're on the flight and you see the coastline and that excitement, I always reminded my children, remember, you're getting to do something that Moshe Rabbeinu never had the opportunity to do. Just, you think about those things. A lot of things that Moshe Rabbeinu got to do that I will never get to do. Like be on a mountain for 40 days and 40 nights with the Shekhinah. That's not on the cards for me. That I know. Like, Panim speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that I got. But there are certain things that I'm going to get to do that Moshe Rabbeinu never got to do. Like set foot on the holy soil of Eretz Yisrael. So when Moshe Rabbeinu cries as he's writing the last 8 psukim, not crying over his death. Moshe Rabbeinu is not scared of death. Moshe Rabbeinu is crying because now it is forever cemented that he will not be able to enter into the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. Overwhelming. So Gemara says, "K'moshe ne'amar lahalon, vayomer lahem baruch mipiv yikara elai es kol hadvarim ha'ila v'ani kosiv ala sefer b'dio." Okay, so also Gemara is just giving an example over here of somebody writing something down with someone else dictating it to them. So also I suggest you understand fundamental machlokes who wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah. Opinion number 1, it was Yehoshua. Opinion number 2, it was Moshe Rabbeinu, literally again getting it dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu writing it down and writing it with his tears. Kiman azal hadam Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba Amarav Gila Amarav Shmona psukim shebetorah Yachid Kore Osan. I will say the last 8. Listen to this. The statement of Rav that says the last 8 psukim of the Torah, you can't divide it up amongst more than one aliyah. The last 8 psukim of the Torah have to be read as a unit. Whose opinion does that reflect? So Lema Rabbi Yehuda he v'delok Rabbi Shimon. Now like Rabbi says, well, it must be Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda held that Allah L'maisa, the 8 psukim were written by Yehoshua. Therefore, they're a separate kind of unit. Therefore, they have to be read as a unit. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. I feel Tema Rabbi Shimon. Hov ishtanu. Now, I will say everyone agrees that the last 8 psukim of the Torah are different. Whether they're different because Yehoshua wrote them, or whether they're different because Moshe Rabbeinu wrote them while crying. Either way, they're different, and that difference manifests itself in that they are read together as one unit. Incredible. 2 dots I will say. Yehoshua Kasav Sifro. Yehoshua wrote his own sefer. He wrote Sefer Yehoshua. V'aksiv Vayamos Yehoshua Binun Eved Hashem. But it says Yehoshua died. So I'll say the assumption always is that people didn't write about their own death. Moshe Rabbeinu might be the unique, might be the exception, but in general, people don't write about their own death. So how can you say that Yehoshua wrote Sefer Yehoshua when the pasuk says that Yehoshua died? The Aske Lazar, right? Lazar, the son of Aaron. Lazar went ahead and finished up Sefer Yehoshua. Lazar ben Aaron meis. But it says that Lazar, the son of Aaron, died. Daski Pinchas finished up Sefer Yehoshua. Fine. Shmuel Kasev Sifro. Shmuel wrote his own sefer. Shmuel Sefer Shmuel. Aleph Beis. Right. He wrote his own sefer. V'aksiv Shmuel Meis. But it says in Sefer Shmuel that Shmuel died. The Aske Gad HaChozeh v'Nasan HaNavi. 2 other prophets, either Gad HaChozeh or Nasan HaNavi finish it. David Kasev Sefer Tilim Adei Asar Zakenim. So David HaMelech wrote Sefer Tilim. Also, it's important to understand that David HaMelech's so Sefer Tilim is not just a compilation of Davidic wisdom, but it also contains the wisdom of these other 10 great men. The Gemara says, "Shav nami Esan ha'ezrachi," but you're missing this man Esan ha'ezrachi from the list. Amra Esan ha'ezrachi is Avram. No, Esan ha'ezrachi is Avram Avinu. Ksiv hacha Esan ha'ezrachi. Ksiv hasam mi heir mi mizrach. Tzedek. So Ezrachi, Mizrach is the same word. So therefore, Esan Ezrachi is in fact Avram Avinu. So the Gemara said, Kachashiv Moshe, v'Kachashiv Haman. So we'll say it's interesting. So on the list of people whose wisdom David HaMelech incorporated into Sefer Tehillim, you have 2 people, Moshe and Haman. So the Gemara said, V'ha Amar Rav Haman ze Moshe. But Rav said that Haman was another name for Moshe. Ksiv Hacha Haman uksiv Hasam b'chol Besi Ne'emanu. So it's interesting. The Gemara is assuming over here that Ne'eman or Haman is a play off the words of Ne'eman, right? Trustworthy. Moshe Rabbeinu was called the most trustworthy person in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's household, to which the Gemara says, Trei Haman Havu. There are 2 Hamans. Moshe Rabbeinu was known as Haman, and then there was another Haman who apparently was part of the Levitic choir. All right, so the Gemara goes right there. Moshe Kasav Sifro Parshas Bilam v'Iyov. Moshe Rabbeinu, let's go back, jumping back to Moshe for just a second. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, Parshas Bilam, and Iyov. So the Gemara says, Misayele Rabbi Levi bar Lachma. Rabbi Levi bar Lachma. Iyov b'mei Moshe haya. We'll say Iyov lived during the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Iyov lived during times of Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Gemara says, Ksiv hacha mi yitain efo v'yichtavun milu ksiv hasam b'ma yivada efo. So we'll say same lashon of efo by Iyov and lashon of efo by the Torah. Ve'ema b'mei Yitzchak. But maybe again, Iyov lived during the days of Yitzchak. So we'll say all the Gemara is trying to figure out. We're going to see. We spend a lot of time on this. Is when exactly did Iyov live? There's a lot of ambiguity here. The way the Gemara is trying to figure this out is by essentially finding the use of the same word as Sefer Eov and other words mentioned in other contexts. So, for example, it used lashon of Ephod by Eov, and he used the lashon of Ephod by Moshe Rabbeinu. So you see from here, Eov lived during times of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara says maybe Eov lived during times of Yitzchak. T'chsiv mi Ephod hu atzad tzayid ve'ema b'mei Yaacov. Maybe Eov lived during times of Yaacov. T'chsiv imkein Ephod zo sasu. Yosef roem. So I'll say. So again, the point the Gemara says is you can't bring a raya from the word Ephod. Why? Because you find Ephod by a lot of different people. To which the Gemara is low highlighted the siv miyitain b'sefer v'yochaku. So I'll say it says who will write this down in the book and will inscribe it. Umoshu deikri mechokek. Moshe Rabbeinu is called the inscriber. T'chsev vayar reishis lo. Kisham chelkas mechokek safon. He saw that the rashis, the first was his, because it has said the chelkas mechokek. The portion of the inscriber is hidden there. So a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. Rava Amar, we'll say first white line on the bottom. Rava Amar, Rava says, no, Eov b'mi meraglim hava. Eov lived during times of the meraglim. Ksiv hacha, ish haya be'eretz utz. Eov Shmo. It says over here, it says for Eov, that there was a man who lived in the land of Utz, and his name was Eov. Uksiv Hasam Hayesh Ba Eitz. And it says by the Meraglim, right, when Moshe Rabbeinu gives them the series of questions, he tells them, are there trees? Is there an eight? And I will say eight. The truth is, the Rashi points out over here, the Rashi points out on the pasuk, is a reference to tzaddikim. Are there any tzaddikim in Eretz Canaan? So the Gemara says, so, Utz eight. What are you talking about? Mi dami. Hacha Utz, Hasam eight. That's two different words, right? Eov is described from coming from the place of Utz, and again by the Meraglim, the lashon is eitz. So the Gemara says, "Hali kamer lahu Moshe Yisrael." So this is what Moshe was asking Klal Yisrael. The Gemara says, "Yeshno li osa adam sheshnosav aruchos keitz." When you go into Canaan, see if you could find the man whose years are as many as or as long as the trees. So apparently, right, trees live for a long time. Eov lived for a long time. Moshe Rabbeinu, his one concern was about the presence of a tzaddik whose zuchos, whose merit could potentially go ahead and serve as an obstacle to Klal Yisrael's inheritance of the land. Umagin al doro ke'etz, and he protects his generation like a tree. Okay, so Yosef will say, so that's the proof that Eov lived during the times of the Meraglim. Yosef Omer Rabbanik Meid Rabbi Shlomo Nachman, Yosef V'Kamar, Eov lo haya v'lo nivra. Incredible. So we'll say, so there was this, right, one of the Rabbanim sat in front of Reb Shlomo Nachman and he said as follows, Eov never existed. Ela mashal haya. Eov is just a mashal. The whole thing is just a parable. They will say, parable to what? We know the story of Eov. So what is it a parable to? The righteous suffer. The righteous suffer. Tzaddik v'ralo. The entire essence of Eov is tzaddik v'ralo, that sometimes the righteous suffer, and sometimes the suffering of the righteous makes absolutely no sense when we look around. So the Gemara says, Ish haya be'eretz utz Eov shmo. What are you talking about? But the pasuk says, the pasuk identifies Eov. There was a man who lived in the land of Utz, and his name was Eov. Elameata ularash ein kol. So the Gemara understands over here that the fact that the Navi identifies, or Sefer Eov identifies as Eov, coming from the land of Utz, and uses the lashon of who, that this must be referring to someone real. So the Gemara gives another example over here. This is by David HaMelech in the episode of Batsheva, when Nasan HaNavi gives him a parable about a man who had one sheep. We're not going to get into the whole parable right now, but it also uses the lashon of who, right? The pasuk ends off by saying, right, Vayilrash in lo kiim kivsa achas k'tana asher kana vayechaya v'tigdal imo v'imbana v'yachta mipito tochal. Because fine. So the Gemara says, so you see over here, just bringing another raya, that sometimes something could be very realistic in its description, but yet could still go ahead and be a parable. Ella mashal ba'alma, hachanami mashal ba'alma. So therefore, again, just like by Nasan Navi, he was giving a parable, so to Eov is a parable as well. Imkein shmo v'shem yiro lama. So again, if it's a parable, then why give a name? Right? Why give a name? Why call him Eov? And why tell us where he's coming from? In other words, I would say parables are given all the time, but parables usually have nondescript characters that don't have biographical information. Here you have someone with a name and a location where he comes from. So why give that? So the Gemara says, V'shemi Lama, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, Darmi Tarvayu, Eov me'ole golahaya. Eov came up with the Jews from Bavel. Right? This is supposed to say Second Temple era. He came up with the Jews from Bavel, ubeis midrasha b'Tiveria haya, and he had a base midrash in Tiveria. So just to understand just the range over here, right? We go, so far we've got that Eov lived in times of Moshe, Yosef, Yitzchak, right? All Meraglim. Now he's coming up from Ole Bavel. He had a shtibel, right? He had his own base medrash. And then on the other side of all this, what do we have? He never existed. The whole thing was a parable. How long did Eov live? Eov lived from the time that Klal Yisrael went into Egypt until they left. 210 years. Eov is very old. So I will say, so now, this puts Eov not with Ole Bavel, so Eov is not coming up again with the Jews in the diaspora in times of the Second Temple era, but rather what? Eov lived during times of the Egyptian enslavement. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara will say, Amadeus, Ema, No. It doesn't literally mean that he lived during the time of Egyptian enslavement. Rather, what does it mean? The Gemara is giving us the duration of his lifespan. He lived the number of years as the time we were in Egypt, 210 years, but lav dafka that he lived actually during that particular chronological time. So Gemara says, Meisvei, Shiva Nevi'im, Nisnavu, Lu'umos Olam. There are seven prophets who prophesied for the nation, for the Gentile nations. Ve'eluheim. These are them. Bilam and his father. Ve'Eov, Eliphaz Hatemani, Bildav Hashuchi, Sofar Na'amasi, Ve'Eliu ben Barach Alabuzi. So we'll say, so now, what's interesting about this? This makes it sound like that what? Eov wasn't Jewish. Right? So in other words, we were trying to figure out, when Eov lived. We just got finished saying that he had a base medrash in Tiberia. Now the Gemara says, by the way, Eov was not Jewish. He was not Jewish. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, no, 1 second. One second, that's not true. I will say, the listing over here is not talking about, some of them are non-Jewish prophets. It's a list of people who prophesied for the nations of the world. But it does not necessarily mean that they were not Jewish. For example, Eliu ben Barachel was Jewish. V'haksid memishpachas Ram. It seems that he came from the Ram mishpacha. Now, Rashi points out that Ram is a shortened form of Avram. He was a descendant of Avram Avinu. So ultimately, again, he was Jewish. Ella inuvi invi lumos olam. Hachanami Eov inuvi invi lumos olam. So what it means is, this is a list of prophets who prophesied for the Gentile nations. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were not Jewish. So therefore, again, there's no raya over here that Eov wasn't Jewish. Atu kulu nevi milo inivelet mosa olam. So I'll say, so the truth is, most of our prophets had prophecies that were relevant for the nations of the world. So what's the chiddush over here? No. Hasam ikar nevusai Yisrael, hachar ikar nevusai mosa olam. We'll say there's a difference. We'll call it our primary neviim. Their major prophecies were for Klal Yisrael, and kind of the information for the Umas Olam was secondary. The listing of these prophets, they primarily prophesied for the nations of the world. Incredible. So Meisvei, Chasat Hayab Umas Ha'olam, there was a righteous Gentile, V'Eov Shmo, and his name was Eov. V'lo Bali Olam Elakadei Lekabel Scharo. And they only came into this world, ultimately, again, to receive reward. So what happened? So he came into this world to receive reward. Again, we'll discuss what that means in just a little bit. And Kadosh Baruch Hu brought terrible suffering upon him. As a result of the suffering, he began to curse God. After seeing this, after seeing that he was not truly devout, and again, I will say, we're going to discuss this narrative in a little bit. After seeing that he was not truly devout because he cursed God as a result of his suffering, so what happened? So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Hashem ended up giving him even more schar in this world, in order to remove or in order to take away his portion in the world to come. So we'll say, so according to this narrative over here, the whole chap of Eov was to test his commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when he suffered, he turned on God. As a result of his turning on God, Hashem saw that he was not devout, therefore gave him whatever reward he was entitled to in this world, and deprived him of a portion in the world to come. So the Gemara says, Tanaihi, this whole thing about Eov, ultimately, the chronology of Eov is in Machlokes Tanoim. Here we go, the Sanya. Rabbi Lazar Omer, Eov b'mei Shvot HaShoftim haya. Eov lived during the days of Shvot HaShoftim. Now what's Shvot HaShoftim? That places him during the times of Megillas Rus. Remember again, how does Megillas Rus begin? Vayhi b'mei Shvot HaShoftim. It was in the days of the judges. So he goes ahead and he lived during the days of Rus. Megillas Rus, Shvot HaShoftim. So Gemara says, Shneimar, Hein atem kulchem chazisem, v'lama zeh hevel tevalu, Eized dor shekula hevel, which was the generation where everything was frivolous. Havi Omer, Zedora shel Shvot HaShoftim. So I says, we're going to see in just a little bit, these days of Shvot HaShoftim, right, where Klal Yisrael was kind of in between Shoftim, in between rulers, there was a certain level of spiritual anarchy. So therefore, again, the Gemara suggests over here that Eov lived during those days. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha Omer, Eov b'mei Achashverosh haya. No. Eov lived during the days of Achashverosh, Shneimar, listen to this, V'lo nimsa nashim yafos kivnos Eov b'chol haaretz. Eov's daughters were the most beautiful women in the entire land. So the Gemara says, Eizehu darshanis bakshu bo nashim yafos. Which generation was it where beautiful women were sought after? Havi Omer Zedor Shachashverosh. We'll say this was the generation of Achashverosh. Remember again, Achashverosh, after he killed Vashti, put on a whole beauty pageant, searching for the next queen. So Ve'ema be made David. Maybe Eov lived during the days of David. So remember again, David HaMelech also sought out companionship. So the Gemara says, Hasam b'chol gevul Yisrael. There, David HaMelech sought out a woman within Klal Yisrael. Hacha b'chol haaretz. Achashverosh did a global beauty pageant. Rabbi Nosson says, Eov b'mei Malchus Sheva haya. The Eov lived during the times of the monarch, right? The Malchus Sheva, literally again the monarchy of Sheva, Shene'emar, Batapel Sheva Vatikachem. So ultimately, we're going to talk about this, that when Eov loses some of his flock, when he loses his cattle, the messenger comes back and says that it was the armies or the groups of Sheva that went ahead and took his cattle. The Chum say, Eov b'mei kastim haya. No, Eov lived during the days of the kastim. Shene'emar kastim samu shlosha rashim. V'yish omrim Eov b'mei Yaacov haya, v'dina bas Yaacov nasa. Get ready for this. Eov lived during times of Yaacov. And who was Eov's wife? Dina, the daughter of Yaacov. The Gemara says, "The ksiv hacha kidaber achas hanavalos tidabri." So Eov says to his wife. Again, we'll discuss the context of this in a little bit. But Eov says to his wife, "You speak like one of the immoral people." Uksiv hasam kinevala asabi Yisrael. When speaking about, again, the rape and abduction perpetrated to Dina, says there was an abomination, nevala, something immoral that happened to her. V'kulu tanoi sfir lehu dio mi Yisrael haba lebar mi yish omrim. So as I say, ultimately again, so when did Eov live? Pretty much any time you put your finger on the timeline, right, it sounds like the earliest time is Jewish enslavement in Egypt. Pretty much bring that up all the way to the time of Achashverosh, right? And anywhere in between you have someone who says it. I've also had now the common denominator amongst most of the opinions is that Eov was Jewish. Lebar mi yish omrim. So I'll say there is one opinion that says that Eov was not Jewish. So ultimately, because if you think that Eov was from amongst the Gentile nations, Basra deshach Moshe Mishaya Shchina of the Kochavim. Ultimately, again, did the Shechina rest upon Gentile prophets after Moshe Rabbeinu died? V'ha'amar mar bikesh Moshe shlo tishra Shechina of the Kochavim. Moshe Rabbeinu asked that Kadosh Baruch Hu that Hashem should not rest His presence upon Gentile prophets. V'nosano, and Hashem granted this request. Shene'emar v'naflinu ani v'amecha. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Kadosh Baruch Hu, let Klal Yisrael be separate and distinct from amongst the nations of the world. So therefore, again, and that distinction manifested itself in the fact that there would only be Jewish prophets and not non-Jewish prophets. So therefore, again, it must be the Gemara says that again, if you're going to say that Eov wasn't Jewish, he must have preceded Moshe. Because if he was a prophet and he was after Moshe, then there were no non-Jewish prophets after Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, again, he must have been Jewish had he lived after Moshe Rabbeinu. Incredible. Rabbi Yochanan, Doro Shal Eov. So I just want to point out something amazing. This machlokes over here, right? So we can't quite figure out when did Eov live. I think that is something very profound. This is more in tomorrow's daf, but we'll discuss the incredible suffering of Eov and what appears to be the needless suffering of Eov. This whole idea that Eov represents this concept of tzaddik v'ralo, that the righteous suffer. So we'll say, the Gemara almost can't find out when Eov lived. Why not? Because we'll say, the story of Eov is a story of our people throughout the generations. In other words, it's not random. How could it be? You can't pinpoint when he lived. Like we could always pinpoint when people lived. It's so strange. Because we'll say, how many Eovs have there been throughout the generations? The story of the Jew suffering in a seemingly random way. The story of the Jew going through the worst type of barbaric and inhumane treatments. The story of the Jew having everything and then losing everything is a story that has repeated, and without rhyme or reason. And yet, with all of that, still maintaining their belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I will say that is the story of our people throughout the generations. And it almost seems as if there is a historical, biographical ambiguity by design. Almost as if the Ribono Shel Olam does not want us to know exactly when Eov lived, to recognize that the story of Eov is part of the fabric of our people throughout the generations. The notion that the righteous suffer, the notion that difficult things happen in this world, and we cannot figure out why. I can't understand why sometimes I suffer adversity and setback, even though I am seemingly doing all the right things. That is the story of Eov. That is a story that has repeated itself throughout history, and that is part of the narrative that we have to get ourselves theologically comfortable with. I don't understand how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. I don't understand why Hashem does what He does. And I have to be able to accept that, even though I'll never understand that. Had you placed Eov in one particular chronological spot, you would have thought that this dynamic is relegated to one part of Jewish history. The fact that we can't place Eov in a particular chronology reminds us that the story of Eov is part of the very consciousness of Klal Yisrael, repeating itself generation after generation. Incredible. Let's go back there. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Yochanan, Doro Shel Eov Shatu B'zima Hayod. Eov's generation was unfortunately steeped in immorality. Shnei Amar Hein Atem Kulam Chazisem. Balama Zeh Hakol Tevalu. Ksiv Shuvi Shuvi Ashulamis. Shuvi Shumi V'necha Zebach. So you use the same notion of Chose, of seeing. It's a reference to a looking at immorality. Imo B'nevuah. But maybe again the Chose, maybe again Lashon of seeing over here is not about immorality, but rather again it's about prophecy. Ksiv Chazon Yeshaya ben Amos. Imkin Lama Zeh Hevel Tevalu Lamali. Fine, Rabbi Yochanan, my Ksiv. Let's go back for just a moment. So if you remember again, one of the places, one of the chronological spots where we put Eov was by Megillas Rus, that lashon of Shvot HaShoftim. So the Gemara says, what does it mean by what does that mean? So the Gemara says, Dar Shofet HaShoftim. It's referring to a generation that judges its judge, that judges its judges. So it's it was in the days that the people judged their judges. So the Gemara says, so what does this mean? So we'll say, so Rashi points out over here, what it means is like this, that unfortunately, the decline of the generation was such that the judges were no more moral or no more righteous than the people they were judging. As a result, the litigants judged the judges. So for example, Amar Lo, Tol kisimi bein einecha. So if the judge would say to the litigants, remove the splinter from between your eyes. So Rashi points out this is a metaphor. Splinter means a small avera. So if the judge would say to the litigant, stop doing this small avera, what would the litigant say? Amar Lo, Tol kara bein einayach. You should take the beam away from your eyes. So the litigant would say to the judge, you're telling me to stop doing a small avera. Hey, buddy, look in the mirror. You're committing bigger averas. And by the way, the litigant wasn't wrong. So again, if if the judge would say to the litigant, literally translated, your silver is tarnishing. So litigants would say back to the judge, your wine is ruined with water, diluted with water. The idea over here is there was such a decline that the judges had no moral authority over the litigants. And when the judges don't have a moral authority over the litigants, so it is an entire. But when leadership can't assert a moral superiority, but a moral high ground. I will say, isn't this the very crisis in leadership that we are experiencing today? Right? You think about this. That everything we see and what's sad is what do we want more than anything? I will say, we want to be able to look up to leadership. That's not perfection. No one's perfect. But you want to be able to look up to a leader and say, okay, that's someone I admire. That's someone I look up to. That's someone who has qualities. I got it. They're a human being. So they probably have plenty of skeletons in their closet just like I do. But at least I see a desire for. I want to be able to look up to someone like that. That's our crisis. That's our crisis that we have today. A difficulty in finding. I'm talking at least in the political realm, people that we could look up to, and at least with some level of admiration. It's interesting. Deep down, I want to be able to put a leader on a pedestal. I do. I want to have a role model that I could look up to, someone who I could admire. I want that. So the Gemara says over here, the problem over here is that when the leadership is more corrupt than the constituency, then that's a whole breakdown. So Vahi me shvot hashoftim, the judges were even worse than the litigants. So when that happens, there's no respect, of course, for the judiciary. There's no respect for leadership. And everything falls apart. I'm Rabbi Shmuel Silber, I'm Rabbi Yonasan. Kala Omer Malchus Sheva Isha Haisa Ein Elatah. So this is interesting. The expression of it, whenever we think about like Sheba, there's always the queen of Sheba. So the Gemara says, whoever thinks that the monarchy of Sheva was a queen is wrong. My Malchus Sheva. So why does it refer to her as the queen of Sheba? Malchus of Sheva. It's just referring. It means the monarchy of Sheba. So again, was there a queen of Sheba? Maybe, but Lamaisa. But Sheva was a real monarchy with a strong monarch. Okay, so now for the rest of this Gemara through tomorrow, we are going to do an in-depth dive. This is very exciting. An in-depth dive into Sefer Eov. So the Gemara says as follows. So how does the whole thing with Eov begin? Vayhi hayom, it was a particular day. Vayavo b'nei Elokim v'yisyasev al Hashem. So we'll say this is incredible. So apparently, everyone's not Baruch Hu. The Rebbe Shlomo convenes a staff meeting. Right? So there's a staff meeting. Who comes to the staff meeting? Or the Malachim. Right? So the Malachim come along to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'yavo gam ha-Satan b'socham. And who comes also? The Satan. Now, tomorrow's daf, we're going to discuss who is the Satan. And then you think to yourself, I know exactly who it is. It's that guy who sits next to me. Mamish, he's like a Satan. No, I mean who is, right? Who is or what is the Satan? We'll get into that more. Right now, we'll just take it, we'll just understand it as this prosecuting angel. Again, we'll get into more depth in just a little bit. So the Satan was there also. Satan. May I in Tavo, Shem says Satan, where are you coming from? Vayana Satan. And the Satan goes ahead and answers. Second one that I will say. So the Satan says, I've been flying around the world. And I never found a human being as trustworthy as your servant Avram. So again, on one hand, he said to Avram Avinu, right, Avram, the land is yours. The land, Eretz Yisrael, is yours. And yet, so Avram Avinu, you promised him the land, yet what happened? Yet when he had to bury his wife Sarah, he had to buy land for 400 zuz. So the land is his, yet he has to pay an exorbitant amount of money for a burial plot. And he never complained. He never complained against you. Hashem said to the Satan, Hashamata hasamta lipcha el avdi Eov. So we'll say this is incredible. So Baruch Hu says, you're right, Avram is great. But by the way, have you seen my Eov? Have you heard about my servant Eov? So Baruch Hu says it's incredible. So of course Avram Avinu is Avram Avinu. But Baruch Hu says to the Satan, you say there's no one who holds a candle to Avram. Have you seen my servant Eov? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, Gadol hanemar be'Eov Yosef mashenemar be'Avram. So the praise that Moshe Baruch Hu gives to Eov is even greater than the praise to Avram Avinu. Te'ilu ba'Avram ksiv ki ati yadad kirei elokim ato. By Avram Avinu it says, Hashem says, now I know that you revere, that you fear Hashem. Ube'Eov ksiv ish tam v'yashar yireh elokim b'sar meira. So Rabbi says, so the accolades heaped upon Eov were even greater, the spiritual accolades even greater ultimately again than the accolades heaped upon Avram Avinu. So we'll have to stop over here for today. Better get right. Shkech, I will say. Incredible. Wait till tomorrow, ramping up the Eov, I will say. But again, you can see already the setup. The setup over here is the Satan praising Avram Avinu. Hakadosh Baruch Hu saying, have you seen my Eov? And obviously setting up the test, the dramatic life test for Eov. And Mir Hashem to be continued tomorrow. We'll say, Shkoyach. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Wonderful to see everyone.